For 18 years, Arthur Vance kept their factories breathing. Not with speeches. Not with slide decks. With his hands. With a pair of ears that cold stand in the middle of 100,000 square feet off screaming steel and pick out. From all that noise, the single-ding sound of one bearing beginning to fail 3 buildings away. For 18 years, he was there, saw the lights stayed on and the presses kept their rhythm and the paychecks cleared every second Friday. And on a gray afternoon in late autumn, they handed him a cardboard box and told him he was redundant. Understand the picture, because the whole story lives inside this one image. Down on the factory floor, a 56-year-old man in a faded work jacket quietly places a coffee mug, a framed photograph, and a small brass level into a cardboard box. And he does it without a word, without a tremor in his hands. And 4 stories above him, behind a wall of glass, in a conference room that costs more per month than he earns in a year, a group of men in tailored suits raise flutes of champagne to the smartest decision they believe they have ever made. They had just fired the foundation, and they were toasting the building. What? None of them understood what not one of those men in that glass room could have understood, because they had never once walked the floor they were standing above. Is that the quiet man with cardboard box was not the janitor of their empire. He was its keystone. And a keystone does not shout when you remove it. It simply waits, in silence, for gravity to remember it is there. This is the story of the 72 hours that followed. The story of how a billion-dollar empire run by men who trusted only spreadsheets discovered the one number that was never on any of their spreadsheets at all. His name. Part 1. The ghost in the machine. To understand what they threw away, you have to understand the factory, and to understand the factory, you have to understand that it was never really a building. It was a body. And Arthur Vance had spent the better part of 2 decades as the physician who kept it alive. The Vance Coriston heavy manufacturing plant sat on the edge of an industrial river valley, a cathedral of corrugated steel and reinforced concrete that ran 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, and never truly slept. Inside it stood the reason the company existed at all, a row of colossal hydraulic forging presses, machines the size of houses, each one capable of bringing down thousands of tons of force in a single stroke, shaping raw billets of steel into the components that ended up inside aircraft, inside turbines, inside the hidden skeleton of the modern world. These machines were old. That is the first thing you must know. They were magnificent, and they were irreplaceable, and they were old. Some of them older than the men who operated them, and machines that old and that powerful do not fail gently when a press of that skull begins to go out of balance. It does not simply stop. It begins to shake, and a shaking press is a countdown, because every tremor loosens the next bolt, stresses the next weld, and if it is allowed to continue, the machine will, with absolute mathematical certainty, tear itself apart and take a section of the building and nesting in it along with it. Years earlier, that is precisely what had begun to happen. The great presses had started to tremble. The vibration crept in slowly, the way age creeps into a body. And the engineers the company hired to solve it, men with advanced degrees and expensive software and no calluses on their hands, proposed replacing the machines entirely, at a cost that would have ended the company on the spot. Arthur Vance proposed something else. Arthur Vance proposed to listen. He was not a man of theory. He had come up through the trade, from apprentice to journeyman to the senior field engineer whose name was spoken on the floor with a particular kind of respect, not the respect given to a boss, but the rarer respect given to a craftsman. He walked, on an average day, close to 15,000 steps across that concrete floor, and every one of those steps taught him something. He could rest a bare palm against the flank of a running press and feel through his skin the exact character of its trouble, the way a farrier feels a horse or a doctor reads a pulse. The men who worked those machines did not call him when the alarms went off. They called him before the alarms went off, when something simply felt wrong. Because Arthur Vance was the man who could hear the whisper before it became a scream. There is a story the floormen still tell about him, and it is worth pausing on, because it tells you more about Arthur Vance than any resume ever could. One winter night on the graveyard shift, a young operator called him at home, nervous, apologetic, certain he was overreacting because press number 4 just didn't sound right. Nothing on the gauges. No alarm. No fault code. Every instrument the company owned insisted the machine was healthy. But the kid trusted the feeling more than the gauges, because Arthur had taught him to. And Arthur drove in at 2 in the morning in the cold. And he stood beside that press for 20 minutes with his eyes closed and his palm flat against its housing. Not measuring anything, just listening, the way a man listens for a sound inside a wall. And then he ordered the machine shut down. The shift supervisor argued the numbers were fine, the schedule was tight. A shutdown cost money. Arthur did not argue back. He simply said, "Open it up," and when they opened it, they found a main drive bearing that was hours, perhaps minutes, from a catastrophic seizure that would have destroyed the press. Taken out the line, and very possibly killed the man standing closest to it. No instrument had caught it. Arthur Vance had caught it with the skin of his hand, and 18 years of paying attention. That was the man. Not a genius in the way the world likes its geniuses, loud and credentialed and photographed. A genius of attention. A man who had made himself, over decades, into the most sensitive instrument in the entire building, and who asked for nothing in return but to be allowed to keep doing the work. And in his own garage, on his own time, with no budget, and no committee and no permission, Arthur Vance solved the problem faith credentialed men could not. He called it the kinetic synchronization valve. In the simplest terms it can be put, the great presses shook, because the immense flows of hydraulic fluid that drove them could not be perfectly timed against one another, and across machines that old, those tiny roars and timing compounded into the violent, self-destroying vibration that was killing them. The valve Arthur designed a deceptive lismal assembly of hardened steel and precision ports set at the heart of the hydraulic system, and corrected those timing errors thousands of times per second, smoothing the flow, synchronizing the strokes, teaching the old giants how to move in balance again. But the valve alone was only half of it. The genius, the true and quick genius, was the software he wrote to run it, a control program that constantly monitored the health of every machine on the line and adjusted the valve in real time. A nervous system laid over a skeleton, a mind installed inside the muscle. He built it. He tested it in secret, night after night. And when he was certain, he installed it across the entire plant. And the trembling stopped, and the presses ran smoother than they had in 30 years. And the company that had been weeks from collapse roared back to life. He patented it. Every line of it. The valve, the control software, the method, all of it filed, and granted and held 100% in the name of Arthur Vance. Not because he was scheming. Because his old employer, the man who had built the company from nothing, and whom Arthur had loved like a difficult father, had told him plainly, "Arthur, protect it. Put it in your name. That way no one can ever take it from either of us." And out of loyalty, out of nothing but loyalty, Arthur Vance then did a thing that no lawyer on earth would have advised. He leased the entire system, the beating heart of the whole operation, back to the company he loved, for the symbolic, almost tender sum of $1 per year. A handshake rendered into a contract. The full legal ownership stayed with him. The company got to use it, indefinitely, for a single dollar for as long as Arthur Vance remained part of the family. For as long as he remained. That clause was not cruelty. It was not a trap laid in advance. It was simply the truth of the arrangement, written down. The heart belonged to Arthur, and Arthur lent it, freely, to the body he served. No one thought about it for years, because no one imagined a world in which Arthur Vance would ever be shown the door. He was the floor beneath the floor. You do not draw up contingency plans for the disappearance of gravity. But the man who had built the company grew old, and stepped down, and sold his controlling share to an investment group for states away that saw in the plant steady profits and irreplaceability, not a family and not a cathedral, but an asset to be fattened and flipped. And that investment group sent a new man to run it. A man who had never in his life laid a palm against a running machine. A man who believed, with the total conviction of the truly inexperienced, that everything essential about a company could be found in a spreadsheet. His name was Elias Thorne, and he was about to fire the foundation. Part 2. The Betrayal in Theglass Room. Elias Thorne arrived on a Monday in a car that cost more than most of the men on the floor made in 2 years. And the first thing he did was hold a meeting about the cost of the coffee. He was 38 years old, and he wore suits that were cut for him by hand and cost $5,000 apiece. And his hands were soft and immaculate, and in the 11 weeks he would ultimately run Theplant, he would put on a hard hat exactly twice, both times for photographs. He was not a stupid man. That is important, and it is the thing people always get wrong about men like Elias Thorne. He was not stupid. He was something more dangerous than stupid. He was certain. He had risen through a world of balance sheets and quarterly targets. And in that world, he had learned an iron lesson that had never once failed him. That a company is a machine for producing numbers, and that any part of it which cannot be found on the numbers can be safely cut away. He looked at the plant, and he saw fat to be trimmed. The investment group that owned him had made their intentions plain: dress the company for sale, drive the margins up on paper, and deliver it gleaming and profitable into the hands of a European industrialbier who had already been circling. There was a specific figure attached, a specific bonus, a specific date. Elias Thorne had a number to hit and a very short time to hit it. And he went about hitting it only way he knew how. He cut the maintenance budget, because a maintenance is a cost that produces nothing you can see until the day it produces everything. He cut the overtime that the senior men used to catch problems before they metastasized. He cut, and every cut made the spreadsheet more beautiful. And the plant itself a little more bright, a little closer to the edge. In ways that would never appear on any report Elias Thorne knew how to read. And then his eye fell on Arthur Vance. On the spreadsheet, Arthur Vance was an expensive senior salary with a job title Elias did not respect and could not quite parse. senior field engineer, attached to a man who, as far as Elias could tell from the org chart, simply walked around the factory all day, touching things. There was a line item too that puzzled him and then amused him. An annual payment of $1 to Vance Arthur for systems licensing, $1. Elias Thorne actually laughed when he saw it. Some sentimental relic of the old regime, some inside joke rendered into accounting. He made a note to clean it up. He did not investigate it. This is the hinge on which the entire story turns, and it deserves to be said slowly, because it is the purest illustration of the difference between the two men. Arthur Vance had spent 18 years investigating whispers. Elias Thorne looked at a $1 line item attached to the single most important piece of technology in the building. And because it was small, Becco's seat was strange, because it did not fit the shape of the world as he understood it. He decided it did not matter. Men who trust only numbers develop a peculiar blindness to the numbers that are trying to warn them. $1 was too small to be important. That was the whole of his analysis. The firing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, because that is when these things are always scheduled late enough in the week that the shock has the weekend to settle. Cynical enough to be routine. Arthur was called up from Thefler, still in his jacket, safety glasses pushed up onto his forehead, and he rode the elevator to the glass room he had entered, perhaps 3 times in 18 years. Elias Thorne did not stand when he came in. He gestured to a chair and had delivered the news with the smooth, practiced, faintly bored efficiency of a man who has decided that kindness is a form of inefficiency. He used the word redundant, used the phrase changing needs of the business. He said that Arthur's role, as valuable as it had no doubt been historically, was simply no longer justified by the numbers, and that the company thanked him for his years of service. Arthur Vance did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice in a very long time. He sat in the chair and listened, the way he had listened to 10,000 machines. And when Elias was finished, Arthur asked a single question, in a tone so mild and so reasonable that Elias never felt the ground shift beneath him. "Does this mean," Arthur said, "that all of my personal contracts with the company are terminated as well?" Elias Thorne, eager to be done, eager to project decisiveness, gave the answer that would cost him everything. He said, with the small dismissive wave of a manicured hand, "Everything is terminated, Arthur. Clean slate. It's just good business. Nothing personal, nothing personal." And here, the men who were there would later swear, something happened in Arthur Vance's face that none of them understood at the time. He smiled. Just slightly. Not a bitter smile, and not a threatening one. Something quieter and stranger than either. The faint, almost gentle expression of a man who has just been handed a gift he was too polite to ask for. He nodded once. He reached into his jacket, took out his access badge, the laminated card that had opened those doors for 18 years. And he set it down on the polished table, squarely, deliberately, like a man laying down a winning card face up and choosing, out of mercy, not to say a word about it. Then he stood, and he walked out, and he rode the elevator back down to the floor, one last time to gather his box. Word travels fast in a factory. By the time Arthur reached his workstation, the men on the floor already knew. And something happened then that Elias Thorne, 4 stories up, never saw, and would not have understood if he had. The line did not stop. You cannot stop a running press for sentiment, but as Arthur walked the length of that floor, for the last time, box in his hands, the men found ways to mark it. A machinist reached out and gripped his shoulder as he passed. An old welder pulled up his mask and simply nodded the way men nod at a funeral. A young operator, the same Kindoff kid Arthur had driven in at 2 in the morning to protect, had to turn away and pretend to check a gauge. There were no speeches. These were not men of speeches. But every one of them understood, in a way the spreadsheet never could, that they were watching Samantha Essential leave the building, and that the place would not be the same without it. And that the men in the glassroom had just done something they would all pay for. Arthur felt it. Of course, he felt it. He had given his life to these men and this floor, and the leaving cut him more deeply than the firing ever could. But he did not let it show, because Arthur Vance had never been a man who made his pain other people's problem. He set his box in the passenger seat of his truck, and he took one long look back at the cathedral of steel he had kept breathing for 18 years, and he drove home. And somewhere in the drive, the grief settled into something else. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of durable, patient clarity. He had done everything right, for 18 years, out of loyalty, and loyalty had bought him a cardboard box and the word redundant. Whatever came next would not be something he chose. It would simply be the arithmetic had always known was there, finally allowed to run. The countdown had begun. And only one man in the entire building could hear it. Part 3: Arrogance, and the calm before the storm. What happened over that weekend is, in its way, the most damning part of the entire story, because it was not bad luck. It was not sabotage. It was the natural, inevitable consequence of a system run by men who did not know what they did not know. Flush with the confidence of a man who has just trimmed a large salary off his spreadsheet, and eager to scrub away every trace of the old regime before the buyers arrived on Monday. Elias Thorne ordered Arthur Vance's workstation examined and wiped. But he did not want to pay for specialists who understood industrial control systems. That would have been another cost, another line item, and Elias was in the business of removing those. Instead, he brought in a cheap, outside IT contractor, a pair of young technicians who were competent enough with ordinary office computers and had never in their lives seen the control architecture of a heavy manufacturing plant. They found the software, of course. It was not hidden. Arthur Vance had never hidden anything. Honest men rarely do. There it sat, a running process, quietly consuming resources, communicating on a schedule with the valve controllers out on the floor, logging the health of every press in the building. To a trained industrial engineer, it would have announced itself instantly as the single most important program in the facility. To two young contractors billing by the hour, staring at an unfamiliar process with an unfamiliar name, humming away in the background and, as far as they could tell, connected to nothing that looked like normal business software. It appeared to be exactly what tired technicians always assume such things to be: junk. A useless background process. Digital clutter left behind by the previous owner. One of them flagged it. The other shrugged. They made the decision that inexperienced people make when confronted with something they do not understand, but are being paid to clean up. They decided to remove it. When they moved to disable it, the system did what Arthur had designed it to do. It threw a warning. A clear and specific alert that this process was integral to plant safety systems and should not be modified. And here again, the story turns in a small human moment, the kind that never appears in any report. They had seen 1,000 warnings in 1,000 computers. Warnings were noise. Warnings were the thing you clicked past to get your work done. They did not read it. They dismissed it. And they moved on, satisfied, to the next item on their list, having just, without the faintest idea of what they had done, pulled the first thread out of the unlithing holding the building together. Meanwhile, Elias Thorne spent this weekend writing a speech. It was to be his moment. Monday morning, the European buyers would arrive for the culminating presentation, the walk-through, the grand demonstration of a lean, humming, profitable operation ready to change hands for an enormous sum. Elias rehearsed his victory in the mirror of a hotel suite. He spoke of operational efficiencies and a streamlined workforce and a business optimized for the future. He was, by every account, irreliant serenely certain. He had run the numbers. The numbers were beautiful. What could the numbers not foresee? And across town, in a modest house on a quiet street, Arthur Vance was having the most peaceful weekend of his life. He slept in on Saturday, which had not done in years. He made coffee and drank it slowly at his own kitchen table, while his cat, an imperious old creature named Bitter, watched him from the windowsill with the particular disdain cats reserve for the men who feed them. In the late morning, he went out to his garage, the same garage where the kinetic synchronizational had first come into being, on a workbench under a Bari bulb, and he did an oil change on his old motorcycle, an unhurried ritual of clean rags and familiar tools, and then he took his wife Aline out on the back of it, and they rode the river road with no particular destination, the way they had when they were young, the wind taking the last of the week away. That evening, he played in his Saturday League soccer match, a group of men his own age chasing a ball across a turf field with more heart than skill, and he laughed, and he was her in the morning, and he did not think about the factory even once. Sunday, he read in his chair with Biter asleep across his feet, and he went to bed early. He was, by every measure, the most relaxed man in the state. He was not anxious. He was not plotting, not really. There was nothing left to plot. He had done nothing at all. He had not touched a computer, had not sent a message, had not lifted a single finger against anyone. He had simply answered one honest question, honestly, set down his badge, and gone home to his life. He slept soundly all weekend for own reason, and one reason only, because Arthur Vance knew exactly what Monday morning was going to sound like. And it was going to sound like 18 years of being called redundant, coming due, all at once. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine that Arthur spent that weekend gloating, because he did not, and the difference matters. There was a moment, Saturday evening, after the soccer match, when Elena asked him gently whether he was all right, whether losing the job that had been his whole identity for 18 years had wounded him more than he was letting on. And Arthur was quiet for a while, and then he told her the truth. He said that he was not angry, and that he was surprised to find he was not even sad. He said that a part of him had known, for a long time, that the company he had loved was already gone, that it had left the day the old man sold it, and that everything since had just been a body running on a heart that no longer Belengetto the people driving it. He said that what was coming in Monday was not something he was doing to anyone. It was simply the truth becoming visible. For years, he had been the only one who could see how fragile it all really was. How completely it depended on one overlooked man. And on Monday, everyone else was finally going to see it too. I'm not going to break anything, Elena, he told her. I'm just going to stop being the only thing holding it together. and then everyone gets to find out what was true all along. That is the thing that separates a quiet man's justice from a bitter man's revenge. Arthur lifted no hand. He set no trap that had not been built in good faith. Years before, he simply declined, at last, to keep saving people from the consequences of their own contempt. And then he went inside, and scratched his cat behind the ears. And he slept the deep and dreamless sleep of a man whose conscience is entirely clear. Part 4. The Tremors. Monday morning arrived cold and bright, and the European delegation arrived with it. At its head was a man named Marcus Holt, the senior technical authority for the buyer, a cool, exacting, smiling executive of the old European industrial school, a man who had spent his career walking factory floors, and who noticed everything. Where Elias Thorne saw a spreadsheet, Marcus Holt saw a machine, and he had come not to be charmed, but to be convinced. And he was very, very difficult to convince. He shook Elias's hand with the minimarmth that courtesy required, and he said, in lightly accented English, that he would like, before any presentation, to see the presses run. Elias Thorne smiled. This was the easy part. This was the whole point of Theplant, the great machines. The thunder of production, the visible proof of a going concern. He led the delegation out onto Thefler, launched into the opening lines of his rehearsed speech about efficiency and optimization, and gave the signal to begin the morning run. And for about 90 seconds, everything was perfect. The great presses came to life, one after another, and the floor filled with that magnificent, deep, rhythmic thunder, and Marcus Holt watched with his hands clasped behind his back and something almost like approval beginning to form at the edges of his severe expression. Elias felt the deal closing around him like a warm current. He spread his hands toward the machines as if he had built them himself. Then the first press began to shake. It was subtle at the start, a flutter in the rhythm. A hitch, the kind of thing that 99 people out of 100 would not have noticed. But Marcus Holt was the 100th. His eyes sharpened, his head turned, and out on the line, the agents were beginning, one by one, to lose their balance, because deep in their hydraulic hearts, the kinetic synchronization valves had, at 6 o'clock that morning, gone still. This is the part that Elias Thorne would never be able to explain to the investors, because it was not an accident and it was not an attack. It was a contract, executing itself. When Arthur Vance was terminated on Friday, when Elias Thorne looked him in the eye and said everything's terminated, the $1 license had ended in that instant. Cleanly, legally, by its own plain terms. The heart of the plant no longer belonged to the plant, and Arthur's control software, which had been running faithfully all along, had been built to do one final, dignified thing if its own license was ever revoked and its own integrity ever tampered with. It would not lash out, it would not destroy, it would simply withdraw. It would take its hands off the machine. Over the weekend, the inexperienced Sechenich had triggered the tampering flag. On Monday morning, on schedule, the software ignored its terms and released the valves, and the presses were left to run on their own. Old, unsynchronized, and violent, exactly as they had been in the days before Arthur Vance ever saved them. The trembling built with terrible speed. What had been a flutter became a shudder, and what had been a shudder became a deep, sickening, structural pounding that Amon could feel through the soles of his shoes from across the building. The alarms began. First one, Thena chorus, red beacons turning, claxons rising over the chaos. Operators lunged for their emergency stops. The floor supervisors were shouting. The great presses, unbalanced and shaking themselves toward destruction, had to be crashed to a halt, one after another, and as each one died, the thunder of production was replaced by the silence of a stopped factory. Which is the most expensive SLS in the world? Watch Elias Thorne in this moment, because it is the moment his certainty meets the physical world for the first time. He does not understand what he is seeing. That is the horror of it, written plainly across his face. He has spent his entire career in rooms where problems are abstractions. A bad quarter, a soft margin, a line trending the wrong way, problems you solve by moving numbers and issuing directives. And now, he is standing in the middle of 100,000 square feet of screaming metal, and there is no number to move, no directive that will help. No one to fire who can undo it, because the thing that is failing is the physical heart of the enterprise, and he does not know how it works, has never known how it works, made a point of never needing to know how it works. He turns to the engineers around him and he issues commands, and the commands are meaningless, and he can see in their faces the commands are meaningless. And that is a species of nakedness that a man like Elias Thorne has never once experienced. He is, for the first time in his adult life, standing in a place where his confidence staircase is nothing at all. Elias Thorne stood in the middle of it, his $5,000 suit soaking through. His rehearsed speech evaporated, roaring at engineers who could not help him. And it was one of the engineers, a young man with grease on his hands and Norrison left to protect anyone, who finally shouted back the sentence that ended Elias Thorne's career, loud enough for the European delegation to hear every word of it over the alarms. The systems locked us out. The control software's gone dark, and it's not ours. The whole thing is patented to Arthur Vance. The name meant nothing to Marcus Holt, but the situation meant everything. He had walked onto a factory floor to evaluate a company at the height of its readiness, and he had watched its irreplaceable core machinery collapse into chaos within 2 minutes of being switched on. Watched its chief executive discover in real time and in public that he did not control, did not understand, and could not restart the single most important system in his own building. Marcus Holt did not need to know who Arthur Vance was. He had learned the only thing he needed to know. He had learned that the man selling him this company had no idea what it was actually made of. He watched for a while longer, in cold silence, as the plant that was supposed to be worth a fortune stood dead and shaking around him. And then Marcus Holt buttoned his coat, and he said quietly to no one in particular that he had seen enough. And he left. And the entire reason for the cutting, the firing, the beautiful spreadsheet left with him. Part 5. The voice of justice. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a stopped factory. And by that afternoon, it had settled over the whole plant like snow. And in his office above it, Elias Thorne sat with the wreckage of his certainty and came, at last, to the single option he had left. He had to call the men he had thrown away on Friday. Arthur Vance was in his garage when the phone rang, wiping down a wrench. He looked at the name on the screen for a moment, and Elena, watching from the doorway, saw him do something she had not seen him do about work in a very long time. She saw him take his time. He let it ring twice more. Then he answered, and he said, simply, Arthur Vance. Elias Thorne's voice was not smooth anymore. It came in 2 registers at once, the executive trying to command, and the frightened man underneath. He began, predictably, with the only tool he had ever really trusted. Leverage. He told Arthur that the plant was down. He told him that this was a catastrophe, that people's jobs were at stake. And then, unable to help himself, he told Arthur that the company's lawyers were already looking at this, that a former employee remotely disabling critical infrastructure was a serious matter, possibly a criminal one, and that Arthur would be wise to fix it immediately and hope for leniency. And Arthur Vance, in a voice of such complete and level calm, that it was more frightening than any shout could ever have been, corrected him, gently, point by point, the way a patient teacher corrects a student who has confidently written the wrong answer on the board. "Elias," he said, "I want you to listen to me carefully because I'm only going to explain this once. And then I'm going to make you an offer. I didn't disable anything. I want you to understand that, because your lawyers are going to want to understand it too. I have not touched a computer since they left your building on Friday. I have been changing fuel on my motorcycle. The system you're describing is mine, the valves, the software, all of it. Patented in my name, which you would have known if you had spent 30 seconds reading the line item you laughed at instead of the ones that flattered you. For 18 years, I licensed that system to the company for $1 a year, out of loyalty to a man you never met. On Friday afternoon, you looked at me in the eye and you told me that everything was terminated. And you were right. It was. The license ended the moment you said the word. My software is simply honoring the contract you canceled. It let go of your machines. That is all it did. It did exactly what you told it to do." There was a silence on the line. As for the remote lock, Arthur went on, and hear his voice did something almost imperceptible. A single degree colder, yes. I designed it to release itself if the license was ever revoked, and the system was ever tampered with, both of which your people managed to accomplish over a single weekend. I initiated nothing this morning, Elias. You initiated all of it, on Friday, with own sentence, and again over the weekend, when you paid 2 children to delete something they didn't understand instead of paying one adult to explain it to you. Elias Thorne began to beg. It happened faster than anyone might have expected, the collapse from threat to plea. Because underneath the suit, he was a man who had just watched his entire future stop shaking and go silent. And he understood now, completely, that the quiet man on the other end of the line held every card there was. He said he would reinstate Arthur. He named a salary. He named a higher one. He said whatever Arthur wanted, whatever it took, they could work something out. Surely they could work something out. And here's the moment: faith men on that floor, and the workers whose job hung in the balance. And everyone who ever heard this story afterward would remember. Because Arthur Vance did not gloat. He did not make Elias Thorne suffer for the pleasure of it. He simply, quietly, took what he was owed. "I don't want my job back," Arthur said. "I'm not coming back to work for you, Elias. I've been trying to get out of that building for about 3 years. And on Friday, you finally opened the door. Here's my offer, and it's the only one I'm going to make. I'll sell you the patent. Outright. The valve, the software, theme thought, all of it full ownership. So this never happens to you again. So you can hand the buyer a company you actually own every piece of. The price is $12 million. And Elias, one more thing. The money needs to be in my account within 20 minutes. Because every minute that plant sits dead is costing you more than you can imagine. And because I want you to understand, just this once, what it feels like to be a number on someone else's clock, 20 minutes. For a few seconds, Elias Thorne tried to find the old ground under his feet. He reached, one last time, forth only posture he had ever known, the executive, the man in charge, Theon who sets the terms. He started to say that this was outrageous, that no one could be expected to move $12 million in 20 minutes. That there were processes, approvals, a board. And Arthur Vance let him get most oft way through it before he answered. And when he answered, his voice had not risen even slightly, which was the most devastating thing about it. Elias, he said, you can absolutely take longer. You can take all the time you need. You can call your board, and your lawyers, and the investment group, and you can explain to them why the factory is standing dead. On the exact morning, the buyer came to see it run. You can spend 3 days doing this properly. I'm a patient man. I've got an oil change to finish. But I want you to understand what you're choosing when you choose to take your time, because the buyer is already gone. And every hour that plant sits alone, the number the investors are going to want from you gets larger. And the story they tell about whose fault this was gets simpler. You don't have a money problem, Elias. You have a time problem. You've had a time problem since Friday afternoon. You just didn't know what Timite was, and that was the moment Elias Thorne stopped being an executive and became simply a man doing math. He understood at last that there was no leverage to find, because Arthur had never taken anything from him. Arthur had merely stopped giving. You cannot threaten a man into returning something he owns outright and you desperately need, and he does not need it all. There was no angle. There was only the price and the clock. They say Elias Thorne made death transfer in 11. There was no negotiation, because there was nothing to negotiate with. A stopped factory, a departed buyer, a furious investment group demanding answers, and the sole legal owner oft only thing that could turn the lights back on, offering a single price, once, on a clock. It was not extortion. Not one court would ever calleth it, and Elias's own lawyers told him so before he even finished asking. It was a man selling something hewn, at a price of his choosing, to a buyer who was free to say no and simply had no reason on earth to. The money landed in Arthur Vance's account. And Arthur, because he was, in the end, exactly the man the factory floor had always known him to be, did the thing that tells you everything about him. He restored the system. Within the hour, working calmly from the laptop on his own kitchen table, he reinstated the software he now no longer owned, but had promised to hand over clean and running. And one by one out at the plant, the great presses steadied and synchronized and came back to life. He did it because the men who ran those machines had never done anything to him but respect him, and their jobs were never the perceive was interested in collecting. He saved every one of them. That was never in question to Arthur. The workers were family, only Elias had ever been the number. Epilogue: the blueprint obsolescence, the plant survived. The workers kept their jobs. And in the weeks that followed, the investment group that owned it conducted its own cold arithmetic on the 72 hours that had cost them, their buyer, and $12 million. And they arrived at the only conclusion the numbers supported, that the catastrophe had been caused, from beginning to end, by the decisions of a single man who did not understand the business had been sent to run. Elias Thorne, who had cut the maintenance, dismissed the warnings, fired the foundation, and laughed at the $1 line item that turned out to be the most important number in the entire company, was removed from his position for cause. He left the building. He had ruled for 11 weeks, the same way Arthur had. Quietly, carrying a box. No one raised a glass. Arthur Vance took his $12 million, and he did not retire to a beach. Because men like Arthur do not know how to stop being useful. He founded his own engineering firm, small one, specializing in exactly the kind of quiet, essential, invisible work he had done his whole life, keeping old and irreplaceable machines alive, listening for the whisper before it becomes the scream. Some of the best men from the old plant came to work for him. He rides his motorcycle on the river road with Elena on the weekends. The cat, Bitter, has claimed the best chair in the new office and cannot be moved. And the men in glass rooms, Theons who trust only spreadsheets, go on believing what they have always believed, that a company is a machine for making numbers, and that anything which cannot be found in the numbers can be safely cut away. They will go on believing it dried up until the moment the floor beneath their floor decides, quietly, without a raised voice, to set down its badge and walk out into the sunlight. Because this was Nevera's story about revenge. Arthur Vance never sought a single thing that was not already his. He raised no hand, made no threat. He did not have the absolute right to make, and destroyed nothing. He simply, for the first time in 18 years, stopped holding the building up, and let men who called him redundant find out. That is the blueprint of silence. The people who hold the world together rarely announce it. They are easy to overlook, easy to underpay, easy to walk past on the factory floor, and easy to dismiss with a wave of a manicured hand. But every empire, however tall its glass and however beautiful its numbers, rests in the end on a keystone. And a keystone, when it is finally removed, does not shout. It simply waits for gravity to remember it was there.